So we have much to talk about today. Your new book, Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's Testimony of God's Faithfulness. I have a number of questions for you about life and leadership, but what was it that led you to want to write this book?
No, not politics, that's for sure. It's not a political memoir. I had no interest in that. Politicians tend to write books about themselves and what they did. And of course, there's a lot of personal experience in this, but it's more a book about what I believe God's done for me. So it was really, as the subtitle says, it's a testimony. This is my testimony. This is where I believe God has been faithful to me over the course of my life, and that took me into the highest political office in Australia, and dealing with those who headed up governments around the world at probably the most challenging time we've seen since the Second World War, certainly in Australia. Pandemics, bushfires, droughts, floods, rising China, regional tensions. It was a bit of a perfect storm there over the almost 4 years I was Prime Minister. But God was faithful in that, as he was in my family life and in so many other ways. And that's what I try to tell the story of and encourage people in their own faith.
Yeah, I mean, no matter where people are, they need encouragement, right? Life is challenging and difficult. Although the position you were in, as you mentioned at the time you were in, incredibly tough things happening in the world, in your country. I want to get into that, but what was your journey to faith? When did you become a Christian? I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit.
Sure. When I was a boy, I was 12 years old. I grew up in a Christian family, a beautiful Christian family, with parents who not only had a deep faith but a very practical faith. They understood that, as a follower of Jesus, that means you did things. You served your community. You served in the church. And so I grew up in that environment. I learned that life was not about what you accumulate, but what you contribute, and not just in a sort of a ministry sense, but in your community. And so that sort of led me ultimately into public life. My brother became a paramedic, so that idea of service is something that we held very highly, and it was inspired very much by our faith. So I gave my life to the Lord as a young boy of 12, and I've been walking with Him for well over 40 years now, and the walk is always fresh and it's always new.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And it's an ongoing relationship, right? If you let it get stagnant, it gets stagnant. That's why you've got to continue to build that relationship like you would in any other way with a person, right? Reading scripture, prayer, all of that. And that kind of brings me to the politics of it all, right? Because politics is a tough business. I mean, and I'm sure there were things you feel, and I can't speak for you, that you did well, and things maybe where there were challenges, but how did you balance always your faith and that intense belief that you had with the role, which encompassed so many different things, I would imagine, and even issues maybe that didn't align with your faith, but that you had to find a position on?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is it's on my knees. That's how I did so, praying for wisdom and discernment and judgment, for humility, and just trying to find that sensible path. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, when you're a Christian in politics, you're not leading some theocracy. You haven't been elected as the Australian Pope or something. You are Australia's Prime Minister, and you must serve everybody, and you must respect all of their interests and views, and including those that aren't the same as yours, and faith positions that aren't the same as yours. We celebrate our democracy, and a Prime Minister who is a person of faith must do that. And I think it's a great sort of testimony of Christian faith to do that. Just as the founding fathers in the United States, wrote it into the Constitution, freedom of religion. That was freedom to have one or not have one, because God doesn't need the government to prove his case or impose it on anybody. I'm sure God's quite capable of witnessing through his church. So finding that and understanding what the role was, but also a lot like Daniel, who I looked to a lot when I was Prime Minister in particular and when I was in politics. Here's Daniel serving Nebuchadnezzar, a secular king with other idols and with other objectives and beliefs to him. But Daniel served as a faithful Prime Minister to Nebuchadnezzar and those that followed him. He spoke the truth. He held his ground. When they told him he couldn't practice his faith or pray, he refused. They threw him in a lion's den. The lions were kept silent. And I think that's how you do it. You just have to be consistent about who you are and not shy about it.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say, and maybe this will be a tough question to answer, I don't know, but what was the hardest thing for you during that time period, the toughest issue, the thing that brought you your knees the most while you were contending with it?
China. And it was as I said before, a pretty tumultuous time. We all were dealing with the pandemic, and that was incredibly difficult and exhausting. But I must say that that one day would pass, the pandemic, and we had to get Australia through, and we did very successfully, probably better than any country in the world. But it was the rising China, the threat in the Indo-Pacific, the bullying intimidation that we were faced with on a daily basis. And the plan was very clear: break Australia's will, make us submit, and that would drive a wedge through the important web of alliances that keep the Indo-Pacific secure and people and freedom alive. Particularly a wedge between us and the United States and our other allies and partners in the region, Japan and so on. And so they target us very heavily. And China is Australia's biggest trading partner. So there's a lot at stake. But we held our ground, and we showed the world that you could stand up to them and you didn't have to take their bullying. And yeah, they got into me and they whacked sanctions on us, did all sorts of things. But we just stood up and we stood firm. And I had great friends here in the United States who were standing with me, particularly, of course, was under the Trump administration and President Trump, but also Vice President Pence, who's a dear friend, written the foreword for the book, Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, who I now do a bit of work with over here in the States. But and then, of course, that carried on in the Biden administration. It became an orthodox bipartisan position.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get into the book a little bit and a couple more faith questions for you, but I do have to ask, are you at all surprised by the current, and I don't want to get you in trouble, I'm just more interested, looking obviously in the position you were in, working with former President Trump, but seeing the options that are on the table right now in light of where we are you at all surprised by the political dynamics right now in America?
No, I've also got a lot of faith in American democracy. It's been a long time. There's been challenges along the way. And I think the number of times I've heard the United States written off, you go back to, the late 70s, it's all over, they're not going anywhere, the unipolar moment has passed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the end of the West. No, resurgent again. And I think that has a lot to do with the resilience and ambition and energy and entrepreneurialism of the American people, for whom I have a lot of respect. I mean, Australia and the US have a wonderful relationship. I was just in Texas last week. I mean, I don't think there's a state of the US which is more like Australia than Texas. We're pretty similar. We've got a similar sense of humour. We've got big sky. Anyway, I love going to Texas, as an aside. But my point is, we're both great countries and we're democracies. And as democracies, it means at the end of the day, we get to decide what it's going to look like. Whoever's putting their hand up, whether it's me, whether it's Donald Trump, or whether it's Joe Biden or whoever, we, the people, we get to decide. And so we've got to take responsibility for our democracy. And make sure it's heading in the right direction. And anyone who wants to put up their hand and go into public office, well, I say good on you. It's a difficult journey. It can be hard. You cop a lot of flack, and a lot of unfair things are said about you. But as one of my chief of staff used to say to me, Prime Minister, if you wanted fair, you shouldn't have gone into politics.
I like that. Yeah, no, to your point, it is very intriguing to me to watch Americans put somebody like, Obama in office, then to put somebody like Trump in office, then to have Biden, and maybe to go back to Trump again. It's an interesting dynamic that I think shows, shifting, sands that, really come and go as issues rise and fall. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But with
I
that,
think it speaks to the strength of the democracy, not the weakness.
Yeah.
On the day I lost the election, after having won a miracle one, which no one thought we'd win 3 years before, I was very mindful of what was happening in Ukraine at that very moment. And, here was a fledgling, nascent democracy fighting for its freedom. And here on the other side of the world, a country like Australia that had come immediately to its aid had a change of government in a very peaceful way. And the continuity of many things remains. Differences in some aspects of policy, which is regrettable from my point of view, but that's politics. People got to decide where they wanted to go next. So I think it says more about the strength of democracy, not its weakness.
No, I would agree. And I think it's interesting that people can shift and change in that way based on what they need or what they see happening in the country, in the world. Things look very different than they did in 2020 right now. They look very different. And so, there are different needs that people have. And so I want to ask you one question about faith and leadership, because it's interesting. In America, this is an ongoing battle, the separation of church and state, this ongoing fight, right? And you were speaking to this a little bit before. Obviously, nobody's asking for a theocracy, but the idea that faith should be completely separate from somebody's life when they're leading, that's an argument that is often made in America. If you're president, if you're in Congress, your faith should not be a part of any of your decision making. It has to be completely separate. How do you respond when people say that in light of the position that you've been in?
Well, I laugh because it's a bogus joke. It's ridiculous. It's a very convenient argument for those who don't want to see the influence of Jesus Christ in their society. Lock them in a room, cancel them, mock them, dismiss them, say they have no right to express their faith. Freedom of religion, and importantly, the separation of church and state, was established to protect faith, not to silence it. It's freedom of religion, not from religion. And it's important that I found as a Christian politician that it would have been dishonest for me not to have been clear about my faith. Does that mean that, every policy decision that I took, I somehow, took as the Bible as some policy manuscript? Well, that's not possible. He also gave us a brain and an intellect and experience and people to work with and our systems and so on. You make the best decisions you possibly can with the information that you have to achieve the objectives that you're pursuing in politics. And, I think Christians walk both sides of the aisle. There's a great podcast which I listen to in Australia. I don't know if you've heard of it, but, it's not about elephants and donkeys. It's about grace at the end of the day, and that's the team ultimately as Christians we're on. We can have our own political views, and that's okay. Can I just stress that to Christians? It's okay to disagree about politics, but it's not okay to be obnoxious and disagreeable and disagree badly. That's not love. That's another spirit entirely. So, look, I think Christians should stand up for, being able to express their faith in the public square, and they should not be driven out, whether it's forcibly, as like we see in authoritarian regimes, or in countries like yours and mine, through the slander and the mocking and the dismissal and the constant berating and the reducing of people on the basis of their faith, and simply because of their faith. I always know I must be on a winner when people can't make a good argument, so they just start personally attacking me and just I've seen some pretty horrible things. Even since I've released the book, it seems to have stirred up some of those who really don't want to see faith in the public square.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. Even, America's dealing right now with this Harrison Butker story, the football player who gave a commencement address, right? And you don't have to agree with every single thing he said in that. I mean, he was speaking to a Catholic audience. I tended to think a lot of what he was saying made a lot of sense. But it's interesting, the idea that person should be canceled, prevented from speaking out. I mean, this is sort of a nonsense idea that when somebody says something we don't like, that we have to make sure that they don't speak anymore. That's a very dangerous way of looking at the world. And we're seeing more and more of that. I'm sure you've experienced a lot of that in your role, in your position.
And it's immature, and it's anti-intellectual as well, by the way. Those who claim this intellectual high ground, but just can't cope with someone who disagrees with them, and can't respect someone who they disagree with. This is the problem. It's about how badly we disagreed in the way that it's done. And I saw those same comments. I didn't see all of those comments. I like what Andy Reid said. If he goes, I go. At the Chiefs, I suspect Chiefs fans felt the same way. But the point about something like that is often you'll say something, and they'll go after you because you are a Christian, and then take whatever you've said, repackage it to suit the audience they're trying to appeal to, and then, go after you with the cancel button. On occasions, people do say some silly and stupid things. And that's, that doesn't help those who are trying to say reasonable and sensible things. But again, it's a democracy. Are we that fragile? Are we that hopeless that we can't cope with people saying things that we disagree with? So long as they're not hateful. I mean, we don't want people engaging in hateful speech. I always find it amazing. I mean, I've been the subject of terribly hateful speech. I'm happy for people to disagree with me. I just don't know why they have to be so rude.
Right. Yeah. It's okay. Just disagree, have a little grace about it and move on.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that you make a very good point there. And it kind of brings me to this book because, I love the title, Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's Testimony of God's Faithfulness. At the end of the day, when somebody picks this book up and they read it, what do you want the impact to be on their lives?
Ultimately, I want them to understand a couple of things. But my testimony is if you can't trust God with everything, you can't trust him with anything. If you want what God wants for you, you've got to allow him to do that. You've got to put aside what you think you want for you. And that is hard. It's a wrestle. It's difficult. I write in the book about Philippians 4, 6, and 7, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds in Jesus. That's hard. That's, to do that, be anxious for nothing? Seriously? I mean, there's plenty to be anxious about. And I say that Paul is saying, it's not that you, as a human being, wouldn't get anxious. Of course you will. He's not denying that. But he's saying to hand over your anxieties to God, to hand over your plans and your ambitions for yourself, and to hand them over to him, to lay them down. That's the Christian life, and allowing God to work through you. And, we can't treat our faith as a vending machine. The other thing I try and say in the book is, look, I found God in the highest of achievements and the greatest moments of despair, and I was blessed in both. The blessing is not the stuff, it's not the thing, it's his presence. And that's what encourages us. That's what makes us look to tomorrow. I mean, when Stephen was stoned, things for those looking in would say, well, that's not going terribly well for him at this moment in time. But there he was, sitting Jesus at the right hand of the Father, welcoming him. And prior to that, his face was beaming like the sun. So, you sort of want a bit of what Stephen's got there.
Yeah, exactly. No matter what, knowing that God is going to be there for you to guide you and that in the end, it's going to be made right. The book is Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's Testimony of God's Faithfulness. It was really great talking with you today. Appreciate your time.
Well, look, I really appreciate the chat, and God bless everyone. And if you get a copy, great. And I hope it encourages you. That's why I wrote it. I don't really consider myself an author. I just consider myself as someone who had the privilege to serve at a role. And if that gives me the opportunity to share my faith, then I will. So thank you very much, and God bless.
I love that. God bless. Thank you so much.